Sound check. Hey, good evening, guys. My name is Dr. Nathan Thompson with the Wellness Way Yorkville. Happy Monday, guys. Hope you guys had a great, awesome weekend. Coming to you live from Yorkville, Illinois. Thank you for joining our live broadcast. If you're joining us right now, please say hello. Let me know where you're watching from. If you're watching the replay, also make sure that you let us know that you're watching the replay too. I love to see people watch our live broadcasts all over different parts of the world. And in fact, I am truly grateful and humbled that you would spend a little bit of time with me. The title of tonight is The Big Idea Behind Inflammation. Make sure you watch this broadcast all the way through because I think it's really important to understand inflammation. I know there's a lot of people who throw that word out there, but a lot of people don't know with inflammation, where it's coming from, and specifically what you need to do in order to start resolving it, especially. So I'm going to talk about inflammation and I'm going to help you see a little bit different perspective when it comes to inflammation, only because I think there's a lot of people who just don't understand it. And this also includes many doctors, also includes a lot of many health influencers as well. So I'm going to give you the big idea behind inflammation and what you need to do in order to start helping to get that under control. Okay. Now, here's some symptoms that are very common. However, I'll say this, it's not normal. Just because they're common doesn't necessarily mean that they're normal. But here are some common symptoms of inflammation: chronic pain, fatigue, poor hormone function. If you understand inflammation, you'll understand how it affects your hormones too. And having a lot of bowel gastrointestinal issues, whether this might be infection, whether this might be a lot of bloating, whether this is uh, issues with your stool or things like that. All of this ties together. And so if you are someone who suffers with that, or you're suffering with a lot of the common but not normal effects of inflammation, and you live within the Chicagoland area, guys, one of the things I want you to do is please, guys, get registered for the inflammation event. This is not the same inflammation talk that I give um, tomorrow night. This will actually be a lot different, but this will help bridge the gap a little bit between inflammation, what we do here in this office, but just to understand inflammation from a little bit different perspective. And so if you have a lot of those common but not normal signs of inflammation, remember, I will tell you this: inflammation is the spark that leads to every single chronic degenerative disease out there, only because of the damage it actually does to the body. So whether it's weight loss resistance, whether it's issues with cancer, whether it's issues with infertility and hormone function, thyroid issues, chronic arthritis, which I don't even talk about, even heart disease, type 2 diabetes, autoimmunity. And yes, this has a lot to do with your hormones as well. And if you have any of those issues that are going on and you live in the Chicagoland area, please make sure that you get registered for our inflammation event. That's tomorrow, January 14th at 6 o'clock p.m. Somebody asked me, this is an in-person event. Okay. We don't do things remotely. In fact, now we had such an influx of people who wanted to work remotely that I just had to shut it off. So this is an in-person event. And one of the ways that you can get registered for that very quickly is if you go on our Linktree profile, which is going to be on our social medias, you'll see the Linktree on there. You go ahead and click on that. This is the first thing that will show up, the inflammation event, to work with me in person. So if you're someone who wants to work with me directly in person, please make sure that you click on that. That'll take you to Eventbrite. You register in about 60 seconds. The only thing that we ask you is that you please show up. I know that we have a lot of people who are registered for that. And the only thing that we ask, my staff works very hard, in order to make sure that you get a first class experience. And we want to make sure that if we're prepared for you, that you're ready to show up as well. So get registered for that event. It's a free event. And if you want to work with us directly, this is how you get into it, as well as get registered for that event. Make sure that you get registered right now, as last time that I checked, we were getting very full for that event. So get registered for it. All right. So inflammation, what I'm going to talk about is actually something that the health profession talks about quite a bit. And in fact, when you look at inflammation, this comes from the AARP bulletin. Somebody brought this to me a couple of years ago, and they were just flabbergasted. Like, oh my gosh, Dr. Nate, you talk about inflammation. Here's what they say about inflammation in the AARP bulletin. It says the secret to good health and a longer life and the cure for everything. And they say this: researchers have linked inflammation to nearly every critical disease of aging. Reduce it now and clear a path to a happier, healthier, longer life. Now, they are, in fact, really right about this. And in fact, if you look at what we do here, and even if you look at what medicine does, we actually agree that inflammation is the spark that leads to every single chronic disease out there. But where do we differ is how we treat it. Where we differ is how we handle it. And in fact, if you look at most of what medicine does, that it's all about trying to knock out the immune system with medications. If you don't believe me, look at someone who's got autoimmunity. And what do? They want to knock out the immune system, knock out the inflammatory process. If you look at someone who's got a lot of chronic joint pain, or they got an injury or something like that, they want to go on corticosteroids, do an injection of corticosteroids in order to lower down the inflammatory process. Most of what you talk about with chronic degenerative disease, of what medicine is actually doing, has to do with trying to lower inflammation medically. Now, the thing is I don't want to lower it down medically. I want to get to the reason why it's happening, so that we can actually start getting you, in fact, healthier and not just inflamed. There's a big difference between the two. It's like me saying, would you rather be smart, or would you rather be not stupid? Would you rather be rich or just not poor? You see the difference between the two? And a lot of what medicine does, I just don't want you to be not inflamed, but that doesn't necessarily equate to health. So you can see that doctors are starting to recognize this, and you'll see a lot of what their treatments have to do with lowering down the inflammatory response. But the problem is that, and I'll show this, not necessarily inflammation, acute inflammation is not necessarily bad. And I'll help you kind of understand that too. And I'll even go over with you kind of the dirty secret of chiropractic as well. And I'll give you a perfect clinical example when it comes to that. So the big idea behind inflammation, and guys, if you understand the big idea, and I'll talk about this at the end, it's so much easier that everything else starts to follow when you start understanding the big idea behind inflammation. Now, before I go into it, I want to give you something that's interesting. I saw this Netflix special over the weekend about a guy. You probably have heard of him on social media because everybody hates him. But his name is Brian Johnson, and the documentary was about what he's doing in order to try to live longer. And this individual talked about why he got so into it, because basically stress, overeating, everything almost destroyed him. And so now this gentleman spends $2 million a year doing things to try to extend his life. I mean, he takes like over 100 supplements a day, and I don't necessarily agree with that, but he gets a lot of backlash. And if it upsets you, I'm like, why does it upset you so much that someone is actually trying to do something in order to help with their health? Now, I don't think you need to spend $2 million every single year. In fact, I guarantee that you don't. But what's interesting, if you look at what this individual does, is really what he's trying to do is he's trying to counteract the effects of inflammation. So he sleeps 8 to 9 hours every single night, doesn't eat any processed sugar, tries to keep his body fat as low as possible. And he also exercises and he works out quite a bit. But what's so interesting about this individual, as I was watching this, because I was like, I'm really interested in what this guy's doing. And one of the things what's interesting that he does is that he takes an immunosuppressant. Isn't that interesting? He takes an immunosuppressant to try to knock out his immune system. But the problem is a lot of people who are on immunosuppressants, or immunomodulators is what you might want to call it, And if you're on that, and this is why he's got to watch out for developing an infection, trying to knock out the immune system. That's why with autoimmunity just running rampant in the United States, and if you look at the commercials, they're like, yeah, long-term use can lead to infection, can lead to this, and this. And that's why, the biggest thing is that you never ever want to knock out the immune system. However, when you look at medicine, a lot of what medicine does is just trying to knock out the immune system in order to lower the inflammatory response. But you want to take it a lot deeper than that, and you want to say, maybe let's actually find where the body could, in fact, be getting inflamed. So that's why I want to give you the big idea behind it. So the biggest question is, and a lot of people ask me this question, Dr. Nate, what could I do to limit inflammation? Here's my answer. Don't cause it. Don't cause it. What could I do to limit inflammation? My biggest answer is don't cause it, because a lot of people don't understand what's causing it, most importantly, and they just think, well, if I take enough turmeric, then my life is just going to be completely, turned upside down, and it's going to be absolutely awesome and fantastic. But you got to figure out, what on earth am I doing that could actually be causing this? Now, here's what we don't understand a lot about inflammation. And if you look at this, what I'm showing you on the slide is a picture of a sprained ankle. So if you sprained your ankle, you came down, you landed on it wrong, you turn it in, this would be a perfect example of what's called an inversion ankle sprain. And guys, I have done that terribly. I mean, I have inverted my ankle, had an ankle sprain so severe, I basically dislocated it. And guess what happened? Did it get red? Yes. Did it get swollen? Yes. Was it painful? Yes. Did it get hot? Yes. And it got tremendously bruised. I mean, it was black from my knee all the way down to my toes. I mean, it looked like I had gangrene. That's how bad it actually was. And it was very, very painful. Now, when that happens, that's an inflammatory process. Red, swelling, heat, pain, all of that. And we've been taught that that's bad and it needs to be suppressed. That's not necessarily a bad thing. If you sprain your ankle, you're going to have to go through the inflammatory process. There's no ifs, ands, and buts, because with the acute inflammatory process, that's how tissues start to heal. That's why if you sprained your ankle, that's why I look at it from such a different perspective. If you have a sprained ankle, you hurt your neck, you hurt your back. I tell people, number one, you want to just make sure that you don't injure it again. See, the problem is that a lot of people almost have a chronic ankle sprain. They keep spraining it, but it's some kind of other injury. It might be injury to other tissues. It might be injury to the vascular system, to the kidneys. And then they can't figure out, that why they're so inflamed. And they're like, well, you're probably doing something to continue to injure it. So if this was an ankle sprain, this is the same thing I tell people, whether if they come in, they sprain their ankle, they have some kind of back injury, neck injury, something like that. I'm like, the first thing you need to do is make sure you don't injure it again. Because if you kept injuring it, then it's never, ever going to be able to resolve. So if it was your ankle, number one, don't injure it again. Number two, start moving it as quickly as possible, because movement is key for healing to take place. So you need to start moving it safely in the right directions as quickly as possible. Number three, don't rice it. All right. Don't rice it, which means rest, ice, compress, and elevate. Rest, ice, compress. And here's the biggest thing with rice, guys. There's no basis in science behind it. And in fact, rice is just pretty much, well, we've just been doing it long enough. And I guess that's just what you start to do. But the thing is you got to understand that with an acute injury, is the body messing up? Is the body messing up? We've been taught that the body messes up so much, but you have to understand, even through an acute inflammatory process, the body's not messing up. It's getting red, swollen, it's painful. There's bruising. All of that stuff has a purpose behind it. And so why would you want to go against what the body already knows in order to heal? And I have proven this, because I remember probably 10, 12 years ago, I had a severe strain of my hamstring, like a grade 3 tear of my hamstring. And I was like, either the body's messing up or the body's not going to mess up. And I never iced it. It turned black. It looked absolutely nasty. I started moving it right away. And I was back from a hamstring injury faster than even the professional athletes. So you don't want to rice it, because the body's not messing up. But one of the things you have to understand is you will need to go through the inflammatory process. And acute inflammation, can take acutely for up to 14 days in order for that to start to resolve. You just have to understand, I have to go through that process, whether it's a back injury, whether it's a neck injury, whatever it might be, I have to go through that inflammatory process. Going to the chiropractor and getting it adjusted isn't going to take away the acute inflammatory process. It may shorten it just a little bit, but it's not going to take the pain away because the pain is actually being caused by damage to the tissue. Okay. So, inflammation. What is it? Okay. What on earth is inflammation? Well, if you want to put it very shortly, inflammation is actually a response of the immune system to tissue injury or to some kind of foreign invader. It's a response of the immune system. So it's the immune system at work. The question is it all bad? It is not bad when it's acute, but where you can start to run into some problems is if it never resolves itself because you keep injuring it or you don't know where it's coming from and you keep causing things to happen. And then you're going to have the body continue to get inflamed. And I'll show you some clinical examples here in just a second um, of what the body does in order to try to resolve it, especially. So is it all bad? It's not all bad. That's one of the things I want you guys to understand is that the body isn't necessarily messing up, but if you keep causing it, yep, there could be some long-term consequences with it. So inflammation, what is it? It's a response of the immune system. So what is the immune system? What on earth is the immune system responding to that will cause an inflammatory response? Okay. So here's the first thing. What on earth will the immune system respond to create an inflammatory response? Number one is tissue injury. That might be caused by trauma, like an ankle sprain. That might be caused by a back injury. That might be caused by a car accident. Of course, you're going to have an acute inflammatory reaction, but there's other things that can cause tissue injury as well. The other thing could be having chronically elevated blood sugars. One of the interesting things about having chronically elevated blood sugars is that it damages your connective tissue. And the reason why is because it causes damage to the connective tissue. And when the connective tissue gets damaged, the immune system goes in to try to clean it up. This is why blood sugar control, guys, is so critical. Because if you look at the people who have such chronic joint pain, even if you look at a lot of the people who are getting their knees, getting their hips replaced, probably have a lot of blood sugar issues. Not necessarily all of them, because some of them may have an acute trauma that just caused so much damage to the joint. But elevated blood sugars, trauma. But here's the other one too, is if you have an infected cell, let's say with a virus, that's going to cause an inflammatory response. As soon as the virus, as soon as a cell gets infected with the virus, it's going to put up a little flag and say, hey, I'm sick and I'm infected. The immune system is going to come along and say, hey, you know what? We got to get rid of you. You got to go. And that can cause an inflammatory response, especially. This is why having proper immune system function is so critical. Things like vitamin D, things like having, a normal amount of killer T cells, things like that. Those things are the ones that are designed for handling viral infections and things like that. So tissue injury will cause an inflammatory response, whether it's trauma, also elevated blood sugars, or if you got an infected cell, or in the presence of foreign proteins. Because if you look at what the immune system is designed to get rid of is anything that's a protein that's not self. So that might be a bacteria, virus. Here's what's interesting. That can also become a food. That can also become a food because if you're not breaking down your proteins the way that you're supposed to, and your gastrointestinal system continues to see a food protein, well, you're going to start to have an inflammatory reaction to that because the body's going to think it's a foreign invader. Here's the other thing too, is toxins. So the immune system is going to respond to foreign protein. That may be a toxin too. And one of the biggest toxicities I see is by far and away mycotoxicity or mold toxicity. And in fact, this gets mishandled so many times because there's no way, it's very hard to look at an immune system panel or just to look at regular blood work and say, yep, yeah, you got a mold issue, unless you're going in and someone's saying, hey, I'm in the presence of mold mycotoxins in my place of work or in my house, or if you're just flat out going in and just testing to see if you're excreting mycotoxins. But that can be a huge inflammatory trigger. So that's why, one of the first things that you want to make sure is when you're talking about someone coming in and they're experiencing so much inflammation is you got to make sure too that you're correcting things like tissue injuries, blood sugars, any infections that are going on, and then make sure that they're not getting exposed, don't have like bacterial or viral infections. This is why food allergies can be so important, but also toxicity and mold can be one of the biggest things that can wreck people, especially over time. It's also another thing that can cause a lot of poor energy, low adrenal function, and things like that. Okay. Now, here's one of the things I want to say. If you have an injury or you get exposed to a new pathogen, then you're going to have to go through the inflammatory process. This is what a lot of people don't realize. And in fact, I'll give you a perfect example. Someone comes in, they hurt their back, they picked up a Matchbox car, they ended up hurting their back and they can hardly move. And they think, I got to go to the chiropractor. Doesn't matter how you cut the cake, you still have to go through that inflammatory process. And it doesn't mean that there's no benefit by doing that. But one of the things I want you to realize is no matter how you cut the cake, you still have to go through that inflammatory process. And this is what I say, I just shake my head, like one of the dirty secrets of chiropractic. I don't think it's a dirty secret. I just think a lot of doctors just don't understand the inflammatory process. Is that you see them, they have an acute injury, you see them, and then all of a sudden it just resolves itself after, 7 to 14 days. And then people think, oh my gosh, the chiropractor saved me. And that's not necessarily the case. They might have gotten things moving early and start moving better, and it may decrease the amount of time that you have that acute inflammatory process. But the biggest thing is that doing that didn't get rid of the acute inflammatory process. And it's also the same thing too. Why, if you get exposed to a new virus, let's say it's COVID, for example, then you're going to have some level of inflammation depending on the strength of the immune system, and that you have to go through it. So it even means that, it doesn't mean that you'll never ever get sick. You may have some issues, especially if your body's seen a new pathogen. I'll give you a perfect example. Back in like June, my whole family, whooping cough went through our whole house. Yes, there was a lot of inflammation. Yes, it was a little bit painful to have to go through it, but we all saw a pathogen that our body had never seen, and we had to go through that process in order for our bodies to be able to resolve and be able to heal itself. And you may think, why on earth did you get whooping cough? Well, I was vaccinated as a child for it, but I still got it. Okay. And by the way, none of my kids have ever had a jibby jab or anything like that. And I'm okay with them going through that process. I'm okay with that because over time, it just makes their immune system stronger as a result. We could go into a whole 4 hours, in regards to that. But here's the proof in the pudding is I had it as a youngster and I still got very, very sick. In fact, I had more symptoms than my kids. My kids had it, went through a little bit of discomfort, went a little bit of pain for 2-3 weeks. But I just didn't feel the best. I didn't feel like I went to 100% until about 6 to 8 weeks. So you have to understand what that acute inflammatory process actually is. Now, the biggest thing I'm going to tell you is what are some of the sources of inflammation? Where on earth could this be coming from? Okay. Number one, fat cells. Fat cells in and of themselves are inflammatory. And this is why you do need to carry a certain level of body fat. But if you are obese, then all that's doing is that's just driving an inflammatory process. So that can be coming from fat cells in and of itself. This could also be if you have a lot of misalignment, and which is leading to abnormal motion, that can actually irritate the joints, damage the joints, and that can cause an inflammatory process as well. It can also be coming from the gastrointestinal system. This is so important, guys, because if you have a damaged gastrointestinal system, this can lead to the development of a lot of food allergies. For example, if you don't have a gallbladder, for example, that can lead to a lot of gastrointestinal system inflammation. If you have low stomach acid, for example, that can lead to a lot of infection within the gastrointestinal system, and it just keeps driving inflammation. So that's why fat cells, alignment, gastrointestinal system. But what about stress? Well, the thing with stress is that chronic stress, especially when we talk about mental stress, will dampen or it will decrease the immune system response. And that's not the body messing up. That is the body trying to say, hey, if you're under a high amount of stress, if you have a bear chasing you, I don't want you to get super inflamed. If I have a bear chasing me, I sprain my ankle. The worst thing that can happen right at that time is to sprain your ankle and for you to get super inflamed from doing that. So this is why stress can lower down the immune system response, which can then make you a lot more susceptible to viral infections and things like that. In fact, even when you look at mononucleosis, people say, "Oh, I had mono when I was in high school." I was like, "Well, what did you do in order to lower down that immune system response? Were you getting enough sleep? What were you doing? Were you under a high amount of stress?" And we want to just blame the virus. We want to just blame somebody giving it to you. But in reality, what you should blame is you should actually blame your resistance to it. So, chronic infection can actually cause that, especially when you talk about the gastrointestinal system, elevated blood sugars. This is why, guys, it's so important that you guys understand and know what your A1C levels are. And I will measure my A1C levels once or twice a year. In fact, the last time that I measured my A1C, which is my 90-day blood sugar average, and basically what it's doing is it's measuring the destruction of soft tissue, which is your red blood cells. And my A1C sits at about 5.1, 5.2. So it sits pretty low, but I don't want any damage to my, not only to my red blood cells, but also to a lot of the connective tissues associated with it. So this is why if you want to be very inflamed, have blood sugar that's spiraling out of control, especially. This is why, guys, we're doing the no sugar challenge, because everybody benefits from lowering down their sugars, especially. And then another source of inflammation is a lack of turmeric. I'm just kidding. Because what's so interesting is everybody, all they want is they don't want to do anything to change their life. They just want to dump a supplement into their system. And I'm going to talk about supplements here in just a second. Okay. But it isn't because of a lack of turmeric. Will I give it to some people? Yes. But it's just there in order to buy you some time until you start handling some of the reasons why people are getting so inflamed, especially. Okay. Now, here's one of the interesting things is let's just talk about, the skeletal system. Let's talk about the spine, for example. Because when I said a loss of alignment, or you're not lining up with gravity the way that you're supposed to, yes, this can cause a lot of issues. Even when you look at x-rays, guys, here's the eyes, here's the teeth, here's the back of the head, and then this is looking at a person from the side, and these are the bones of the neck. So one of the first things that you want to see when you look at the bones of the neck is you want to see that there is actually a curve there, okay? So when there's a curve there, the spine is a lot stronger and resistant to injury than if there's no curve that's there. But here's what's interesting. It's not about a joint. It's about what's sitting inside the spine, which is the spinal cord. What's so interesting about the spinal cord is that it is tethered, or it is connected right at the skull, and it's also tethered down at about T12L1. It's tethered back into there. So it's tied at both ends. When you have a proper curve in the spine the spinal cord is actually in a relaxed position. This is one of the most amazing things, because you want to lower stressors, start working on getting a curve in your neck, especially because it just takes a lot of stress off of the spinal cord. Now, if you have some kind of injury, this might be acute, this might be chronic, this might be if you get in a car accident, you have a really, really bad fall, or you just decide, I'm going to put my head down in this position for chronically long period of time, like a lot of kids are actually doing, and you see a straightening of the neck. Well, one of the first things that happens, you see a straightening of the neck, is the first thing it'll do is it'll take the spinal cord from curved and relaxed to very, very tense. Now, watch this. The spinal cord is basically just an extension of the brain. It's just an extension of the brain. And so because it's tethered, now it starts to stretch it out. Do you think the brain's going to get a little bit stressed as a result of that? And the answer is yes. But here's what's also so interesting. If you don't have proper curves, you will start to lose motion within your neck. If you start losing motion in through the neck, and what happens is the disc will start to decay, the tissue will get damaged, they'll start to get chronically inflamed. And then one of the things that you will see is then as a result of just chronic inflammation, you'll start to see calcification take place. So if you look at here and then you just see a continuation of it, now what you see is you start to see calcification of those bones that are in through the neck. And the calcification is just a response of long-term inflammation. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in just a second. But then when people just ignore it, then what happens is it just gets so inflamed that the whole system just starts to just get so inflamed, the disc deteriorate, the spine develops degenerative disc disease. Yes, you can call that arthritis. And in fact, when people say, my doctor told me I had arthritis, I mean, inflammation of a joint. That's literally what the definition of it is. But you got to figure out why it's getting so inflamed. But one of the things is you're going to see such poor motion that when these bones, they stop moving the way that they're supposed to, they'll start to deteriorate and they'll start to decay. And you'll see a lot of these things, they'll just start to fuse together as a result. Now, if this was just the neck and you're just talking about neck pain, that would just be one thing. But you're talking about the spinal cord that's connected to the brain. And now, one of the things you'll see some destruction and some damage take place in through the spinal cord that's going out and reaching out to every single cell, tissue, organ, gland inside the body. And this is why it's so important to make sure that you are lining up with gravity the way that you're supposed to. Because if you're not, there's going to be a lot of issues that start to take place. And this is why, you know, if someone comes in and they're from the area, I'm like, you need to take that stress off of the body. Sometimes my people might come in from a long period, long drive away. You know what I tell them? You need to start doing some of these home exercises in order to get a handle on this. And you need to start doing them every single day. And this is why you got a lot of chronic inflammation around the spine, around the nerve system too. Changing that can have a profound impact on a person's health. But it's not the only place where people are getting some kind of inflammation. This is why I say this. If you want less inflammation, keep your barriers healthy, okay? Keep your barriers healthy. Well, Dr. Nate, what on earth are the barriers? The barriers are the things that separate internal versus external environment. I'll give you a perfect example. Your skin is a barrier. This is the external environment. Past the skin is the internal environment. So you have to keep the barriers healthy. So what are some of the barriers? The skin is a barrier. The lungs are a barrier. This is how a virus can enter or a bacteria can enter in, is through the barriers. That's why you got to keep your lungs healthy. You know what's so interesting? You understand, you see a lot of kids when they start getting inflamed, you start noticing they suffer with asthma, okay? It's an immune response. So got to keep the lung barrier healthy. This is why smoking can be so damaging to the body. You got to keep the gastrointestinal system barrier healthy. You know, and anybody who loves alternative health and natural health, you know, I'll ask them this. I'm like, where does most of your immune system sit? And they're like, sits in the gastrointestinal system. I'm like, well, you're kind of right, but why? And they're like, somebody just told me that. And it's like, I tell people, don't ever take my word for it. Okay. Go ahead and research this yourself. But the gastrointestinal system has a lot of immune cells that are sitting there. But you know what else is considered a barrier? The vascular system. And this is why if you got blood sugar issues and things like that, you start damaging the vascular system. This is why you can start getting a lot of inflammation within the vascular system. And remember this, you get a lot of inflammation in the vascular system, then you're going to start to get atherosclerosis. It's going to start to calcify and things like that. And that's why blood sugars are going to be so important, especially. However, if you start having a lot of gastrointestinal type issues and the barrier starts to break down, you're going to notice that you're going to develop a lot of skin issues. You're going to notice that other areas start to get inflamed as well. And that's why keeping your barriers are so healthy, because that's where your immune system sits. A lot of your immune system sits. Most of it doesn't sit in the blood. Most of it is sitting around the barrier. And in fact, it's by design, because where do you want to defend the castle? You want to defend the castle along the castle wall. You don't want to put all your soldiers inside of the castle and let the enemy just, you know, run through and then try to fight it once it's already inside the body. So it wants to handle it at the periphery, not necessarily when it's already inside the body. And that's why keeping your barriers are so important. And I want to give you a clinical example. And the next slide I show you after that is going to make your jaw drop. So here's an individual who came in, and this individual didn't have a gallbladder. This individual hadn't had a solid normal bowel movement for many, many, many months. And so I said, here's what I want you to do. And this individual too had a lot of inflammatory conditions and had a lot of valve issues in their heart, you know, things like that. So I'm like, let's actually look at some of the barriers. So we did a stool test. So what's interesting, if you look at a stool test, is you see that his barrier is extremely, extremely inflamed. And in fact, it was so inflamed for such a long period of time that one of the things that you can see is the presence of blood. You see the presence of occult blood or hidden blood within the stool test. You know that something is extremely inflamed. And I looked at him. I was like, yeah, you need to make sure that you go to your doctor to make sure there's not any colon cancer or anything like that. He's like, I already checked. It's, you know, it's not there, but it was just so much damage that just kept slamming. You know, the barrier was actually bad enough to make it start to bleed. And then when you look at this, one of the things that you see is the presence of a lot of additional bacteria just because the environment was so bad. And there's some other things that were going on too with him as well. But here's what's so interesting is that this person was on a statin drug. So he's taking a statin drugs in order to try to crush that LDL, try to get the LDL down quite a bit. But here's what was so interesting is that he still had a very high C-reactive protein, which meant he still was extremely inflamed, homocysteine, extremely inflamed, a lot of liver issues that are going on, and also lipoprotein little a. Lipoprotein little a is a high cardiovascular risk indicator, as well as CRP and homocysteine. But taking a statin drug, all it did was lower down the LDL, but it didn't get rid of all of these other risk factors for having a heart attack. That was so interesting. So if you look at him, he is extremely, extremely inflamed. And I want to show you something, because people will ask me all the time about my cholesterol and blah, 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 and all of that. This comes from the National Library of Medicine, National Institutes of Health. And here's the title of what they talked about: the effect of inflammation and infection on lipids and lipoproteins. Now, I want you to stay with me on this, because here's what's so interesting about this. And here's what they say. Chronic inflammatory diseases such as rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, and psoriasis, and other infections such as periodontal disease. This is why they have linked periodontal disease to higher risk of heart disease, and HIV, are associated with an increased risk of cardiovascular disease. Patients with these disorders have an increase in coronary artery calcium, meaning their arteries calcify because they're inflamed. I'm going to talk about that in just a second. So inflammation and infections induce a variety of alterations in lipid metabolism that may initially dampen inflammation or fight infections. Now listen to this. But if chronic, could contribute to the increased risk of atherosclerosis. The most common changes are decreases in serum HDL and increases in triglycerides. They go on to say this: with inflammation, there is also a consistent increase in lipoprotein little a, which we saw on that lab value, lipoprotein little a levels due to increased apolipoprotein A synthesis. LDL levels are frequently decreased in the prevalence of small, dense LDL. LDL levels are frequently decreased, but the prevalence of small, dense LDL is increased. Okay. So in the presence of high inflammatory triggers, look for lipoprotein little a especially. And here's the thing, they're not even measuring this. But what they go on to say is this: the greater the severity of the underlying inflammatory disease, the more consistently these abnormalities in lipids and lipoproteins are observed. All right. So the more common they are observed, and this is why doctors say it's just about cholesterol, just about cholesterol, just about cholesterol. I'm like, no, it's not. It's about inflammation. It's about inflammation. And that's why people do have lipoprotein little a, and you see that's really elevated. Like, where are some of these inflammatory triggers coming from? And so that's why you really need to get a handle on it. And you need to start looking deeper, especially when it comes to inflammation. Now, what about supplements? Okay. What about supplements? Because if you go to a this for that, type doctor, or go to a functional medicine doctor, I will tell you this, that most of the time, all they're doing is just saying they're just dumping this in for that. And it's just a this for that approach. Here's my take on supplements. You want to know who takes the most supplements? People with mold, by far and away. And there's a reason for that. But here's the big idea behind supplements. Supplements are there to buy you time until you correct the cause. Supplements are there to buy you time until you correct the cause. And in fact, as I work with people, I'm like, are you willing to get this through food? And if they're like, nope, I'm like, okay, keep taking liver then. Are you willing to get this through food? Are you willing to take sauerkraut? And they're like, nope. I'm like, okay, then you're just going to need to take this. I'm like, are you willing to make sure that you're getting 4,000 milligrams of potassium every single day? And they're like, nope. I'm like, okay, then you're going to need to take potassium. But they're just there to buy you time until you start correcting the causes. That's one of the biggest things. And that's why I don't want people just being just a chronic supplement taker without truly getting to the reason why some of those things are happening, without getting the proper testing and things like that. Calcification. So I know in the last couple of slides, I talked about calcification of the spine, calcification of the arteries, calcification of the thyroid. What does that mean? What does it mean if I go in and take an X-ray and I got calcification in certain areas? Well, really what it means is it just means long-term inflammation. Okay. If you got any kind of arthritic issues going on in through the spine, then the reality is you have long-term inflammation. People will come to me like, oh my gosh, I have calcification on my thyroid. I'm like, congratulations. The thyroid has been inflamed for a long period of time. And in fact, if you're on a thyroid medication and the doctor hasn't figured out why you're hypothyroid, and let's say, um, you have some thyroid destruction with Hashimoto's or something like that, you're probably going to see some thyroid calcification take place. And that's just destruction of the thyroid, meaning it's been inflamed for a very, very long time. If you see calcification within the arteries, let's say you go and you get a coronary artery calcium score or a CAC score, and they're like, yep, there's a lot of calcification taking place in the arteries. That just means that the arteries have been inflamed for a very long period of time, which has led to the deposition of calcium. And in fact, initially you won't see calcification. You'll see soft plaquing that won't show up on a CAC score. But you will, over time, you'll see that it will calcify. So this is why if people say, oh, it's in my arteries, I'm like, yeah, it's just really, really inflamed. You need to start looking and start thinking deeper, especially. So the big idea behind this of what causes inflammation is you have to look at this, because this is the whole chiropractic principle. Chiropractic principle is this, is that the body is a self-healing, self-regulating organism, and it really doesn't need help. But one of the things you need to do is you need to make sure that you're not interfering with it. And that's why what can cause the inflammatory process, having a lot of mental stress. Ladies, mental stress will crush you. In fact, here's what I say. Women will stress themselves to death and men will eat themselves to death. That's usually the issue. Mental stress is huge, but ladies, if you aren't willing to get your mental stress under control, this will affect your hormone function quicker than anything else. And it'll affect it a lot quicker than a man, especially. You have to see where this inflammation is coming from. This might be coming from chemical as well. And this is why the gastrointestinal system, the liver, food allergies, things like that, you have to make sure that you are looking at. And then you may have some physical stressors. And these are things that are affecting the spine. These are things that are affecting the nerve system. Yes, even affecting the brain as well. And that's why all three sources are just hugely important. But a lot of times people go to a chiropractor and they just address just the physical without addressing the mental and addressing the chemical. This is why you really do have to start addressing all of those different things in order to lower inflammation. In fact, you really do want inflammation as low as possible. But guess what? You don't have to be like Brian Johnson and spend $2 million a year and take 110 supplements every single day and be on immunosuppressants just to get the desired result. But you do need to work on mental, chemical, and physical stressors that is leading to inflammation. And this is one of the reasons why, guys, coming up tomorrow, January 14th at 6:00 p.m., this is why we're doing our approach to inflammation talk. And I will talk a little bit deeper about this. In fact, even going a little bit more in testing. So if you're from the Chicagoland area and you want to work with us directly, please make sure that you go ahead and you go to our socials, look at our link tree, click the link, and you will be able to register for it. I would do that right now, just to make sure that we have, because we do have a limit on how many people can register for it. So go ahead, please make sure that you try that just to make sure that will actually go through. But we do an inflammation talk every 3 weeks. And why do we do it? Because I want you to understand the big idea. Because when I say, oh, I have this that's going on, most of the time people are coming in with no idea behind inflammation, and they think you need to balance your hormones. They think you need to do this or do this. And then when I say, hey, great, here's the testing I want you to get, you're like, okay, that makes sense. Now I understand why we need to handle it this way, especially. So make sure that you register, please, and get to that inflammation event if you are from the Chicagoland area and you want to work with us directly. Now, in addition to that, with the Wellness Way, we do a lot of challenges, and our challenges going on in January is the No Sugar Challenge. And the big idea behind the No Sugar Challenge is just to start lowering down the amount of sugar that you are consuming. Okay. We're not demonizing carbohydrates, but yet too many people eat too many carbohydrates, and that can lead to blood sugar issues. And that can lead to a lot of destruction of the soft tissues, whether that can age your skin a lot quicker, whether that can damage the kidneys, whether that can damage the soft tissues, including your vascular system, whether that can cause some fatty liver and things like that. And so everyone can benefit by just starting to lower down their sugars, especially. So if you go to our link tree, you'll see at the top the inflammation event. If you go here, I put a link on there that if you click that, you'll get some free resources as far as the foods to avoid, foods to enjoy with the no sugar challenge. Yes, we started January 1st, but even if it's halfway through January, you can still get involved with that because January 1st is not some magical date. Okay. Even though I know a lot of people start thinking about their health right around that time. But the reality is you can start at any time. There's also a wonderful challenge page with over 30,000 people in it called the Wellness Way Challenge page. And just gives people the opportunity to ask some questions regarding the no sugar challenge. And we have doctors on there and nutrition specialists and things like that that can answer your questions that you might have. But make sure you get that free guide so that you can download that and you can start just start avoiding the sugars, especially. Now, here's what I want to tell you. Here's my final thought. Get the big idea and all else follows. Okay. This is why, get the big idea behind inflammation. Get the big idea behind the chiropractic principle. Get the big idea behind the wellness way. That's why, one of the overarching themes with wellness way is inflammation, inflammation, inflammation. And I've seen actually a lot of doctors who just have no idea what inflammation is, and they just poo-poo it, and whatnot. And I'm like, inflammation is a response of the immune system, and you do need inflammation if there's been any kind of tissue injury or a foreign protein or something like that. But it's one of the things that you want to do to make sure that you're not continually causing it. And it's the same thing in the no sugar challenge because on that page, people are asking like questions. I'm like, you know what? If you got the big idea, that's a question that you wouldn't be asking. So get the big idea. And guys, if you get the big idea behind health and things like that, then all else becomes a whole heck of a lot easier. And that's why when people say, well, how do you know this about this? I'm like, because I have the big idea and all it takes is everything else starts to follow. You can learn a lot more if you get the big idea first and everything else follows. That's one of the biggest things I want you to realize is just work on getting the big idea. And hopefully what I went over tonight gives you kind of the big idea behind inflammation. Is inflammation bad? Nope. But you don't want to continue to cause it as well. So make sure you're doing some things in order to identify what it is, where it's coming from, and what you can do to clear a path towards a longer, healthier life, especially for you. But get to the inflammation event too. Make sure that you're getting to the inflammation event, and that'll give you an opportunity for me to work with you, probably get some different labs, look at some things in order to say, here's what you need to do in order to start getting your life and getting your health back. But I'm going to give you fair warning. You're going to have to start changing some things. You're going to have to start changing your lifestyle because there's nothing more important than your lifestyle. There's nothing that's more powerful than your lifestyle. Your lifestyle is more important than herbs. Your lifestyle is the most important thing. And that's one of the things that you have to be willing to start to change. And that's the big idea behind inflammation. So guys, if you found value with this, make sure that you like this video. Make sure that you share this video with other people as well. Share it with people, especially, who need help. And also make sure you get to that inflammation talk if you're from the Chicagoland area. And if you're not for some reason, please make sure you go to wellnessway.com and start to work with a doctor who can work remotely as well. So Lord willing, I'll try to go live next week. So we'll see if I'll be able to do that. I will do my best, but just make sure that you're following our page in order to get updates as far as if we're going live and when we're going live. Thank you again, guys, so much for watching. Please make sure that you share this video, and I hope you got the big idea behind inflammation. The biggest thing I will tell you is now get to work. Get to work. And I wish you guys the best of health. Thank you guys so much. I love all of you, and I hope you guys have a great, awesome rest of your week as you start the new year. So be well, be blessed, and as I always say, remember who you are.